In the year 800, Viking power was a hurricane. It was unpredictable, violent, and it only moved in one direction, toward the gold. But by the year 1000, the hurricane had stopped. The longships were being replaced by stone walls, legal codes, and tax collectors. Historians usually credit this change to the great kings, but if you look at the actual gears of history, you find three women who did something much more difficult than swinging an axe. Women who redirected the raw kinetic energy of the Norsemen. Today, we are looking at the three architects of the post-Viking world. Æthelflæd, who contained the Northmen in England, Freydís, who tested the limits of Viking morality at the edge of the map, and Olga, who turned a tribe of raiders into the foundation of the Russian state. This isn't a story about warrior princesses, it's a story about the birth of the modern world. We start in 911 AD. England is a mess. The Vikings have settled in the north and east, creating a state within a state called the Danelaw. The Saxon world is shrinking. When the Lord of Mercia died, the rule passed to Æthelflæd, his widow. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle written by her brother's court practically ignores her. But the Mercian Register tells the truth. Æthelflæd was a tactical genius. She understood that Viking power was based on speed. If they could move, they could win. So, she made it impossible for them to move. She implemented the burh system. She didn't just build forts. She built fortified economic hubs like Tamworth, Stafford, and Warwick. These were laid out on a grid system with thick earthen walls and deep ditches. In 917, she took the fight to them. She captured Derby, one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, not through a messy field battle, but through a calculated siege. When she lost 4 of her high-ranking officers at the town gate, she didn't retreat to mourn. She immediately pivoted her forces to Leicester, which surrendered without a fight. Why? Because the Vikings realized that Æthelflæd wasn't just raiding, she was annexing. She redirected Viking energy outward by containing them behind a wall of civilized, tax-paying cities. By the time she died in 918, she had essentially gifted her brother, Edward the Elder, the blueprint for a unified England. In Mercia, Viking movement was slowed and reshaped. Across the Atlantic, it was unleashed. Now we leave the fortified towns of England and step into the uncertain wilderness of Vinland. While Æthelflæd was building walls in the east, a woman named Freydís Eiríksdóttir was pushing the Viking spirit to its absolute breaking point in the west. We have 2 conflicting accounts of Freydís. In the saga of Eric the Red, she's a hero. When the Skrælings, the indigenous people of Vinland, attacked the Norse camp, the Viking men fled. Freydís, 8 months pregnant, picked up a sword and slapped it against her bare breast, letting out a war cry so terrifying that the attackers retreated. But the saga of the Greenlanders tells a much darker story. It's here we see how she redirected Viking power inward. Vinland was a vacuum. No king of Norway, no law of the thing. In 1004, Freydís entered a partnership with 2 brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, to harvest timber, the liquid gold of the North Atlantic. But the colony was small, and resources were tight. Freydís didn't want to share the profit. She manipulated her husband into believing the brothers had insulted her, and then she orchestrated a midnight massacre. When the Viking men refused to kill the 5 women in the rival camp, Freydís took up an axe and did the job herself. This looks like a true crime story, but historically, it's about the collapse of the Viking social contract. Freydís realized that in the absence of a state, the only power that mattered was the one that was most willing to be brutal. She redirected the berserker energy against her own kin, effectively ending the Vinland experiment. She returned to Greenland, a wealthy woman, but she left behind a colony that had literally eaten itself. Finally, we look at the east, the Kievan Rus. Back in 945 AD, this place was just a Viking protection racket. Olga's husband, Igor, was murdered by the Drevlian tribe because he tried to collect a second round of taxes in the same month. The Russian Primary Chronicle records Olga's revenge in 4 cinematic acts. She buried the Drevlian negotiators alive in a boat. She burned their second set of ambassadors alive in a bathhouse. She slaughtered 5,000 Drevlians at a funeral feast. She burned their capital city, Iskarostan, using birds with flaming embers tied to their feet. If you stop at the birds, you miss the point. The birds were a message. Olga realized that the Viking way, collecting tribute by force, was why her husband was dead. It was unstable. She spent the next decade redirecting that power upward into the machinery of the state. She established the Iroki fixed tax rates and the Pagosti administrative centers. This was the first legal reform in Eastern European history. She then traveled to Constantinople to meet Emperor Constantine VII. She wasn't just there to convert to Christianity. She was there for a status upgrade. By the time she stepped down, the Kievan Rus was no longer a gang of Swedish raiders. It was a recognized European power with a centralized government. Olga turned a blood feud into a bureaucracy. Æthelflæd, Freydís, and Olga never met, but they all faced the same problem. How do you survive a culture that is built on nothing but movement and violence? Æthelflæd showed that the Viking could be contained by a city. Freydís showed what happens when the Viking spirit is left to rot on the frontier. Olga showed that the Viking could be tamed by the law. The Viking Age didn't end with a bang. It ended with a signature, a tax code, and a brick wall. These women weren't just part of history. They were the ones who decided which parts of the Viking world were allowed to survive. More fascinating stories of powerful women in history, watch on our channel.